Section 8 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 4, Part 2. In consequence of the first of a series of accidents to our wheels, we were for several days the guests of the director of the Botanical Gardens at Pishpek. As a branch of the Crown Botanical Gardens at St. Petersburg, some valuable experiments were being made here with foreign seeds and plants. Peaches, we were told, do not thrive, but apples, pears, cherries, and the various kinds of berries grow as well as they do at home. Rye, however, takes 3 years to reach the height of 1 year in America. Through the Russians, these people have obtained high-flown ideas of America and Americans. We saw many chromos of American celebrities in the various station houses, and the most numerous was that of Thomas A. Edison. His phonograph, we were told, had already made its appearance in Pishpek, but the natives did not seem to realize what it was. "Why," they said, "we have often heard better music than that." Dr. Tanner was not without his share of fame in this far-away country. During his fast in America, a similar, though not voluntary, feat was being performed here. A Kirghiz messenger who had been dispatched into the mountains during the winter was lost in the snow, and remained for 28 days without food. He was found at last, crazed by hunger. When asked what he would have to eat, he replied, "Everything." They foolishly gave him everything, and in 2 days he was dead. For a long time he was called the Dr. Tanner of Turkestan. A divergence of 75 miles from the regular post route was made in order to visit Lake Issyk Kul, which is probably the largest lake for its elevation in the world, being about 10 times larger than Lake Geneva and at a height of 5,300 feet. Its slightly brackish water, which never freezes, teems with several varieties of fish, many of which we helped to unhook from a Russian fisherman's line, and then helped to eat in his primitive hut near the shore. A Russian Cossack, who had just come over the snow-capped Alatau of the Shade from Fort Narin, was also present, and from the frequent glances cast at the fisherman's daughter, we soon discovered the object of his visit. The ascent to this lake, through the famous Buam Defile, or Happy Pass, afforded some of the grandest scenery on our route through Asia. Its seething, foaming, irresistible torrent needs only a large volume to make it the equal of the rapids at Niagara. Our return to the post road was made by an unbeaten track over the Alatau Mountains. From the Chu Valley, dotted here and there with Kirghiz tents and their grazing flocks and herds, we pushed our wheels up the broken path, which wound like a mythical stairway far up into the low-hanging clouds. We trudged up one of the steepest ascents we have ever made with a wheel. The scenery was grand, but lonely. The wild tulips, pinks, and verbenas dotting the green slopes furnished the only pleasant diversion from our arduous labor. Just as we turned the highest summit, the clouds shifted for a moment and revealed before us 2 Kirghiz horsemen. They started back in astonishment, and gazed at us as though we were demons of the air, until we disappeared again down the opposite and more gradual slope. Late in the afternoon we emerged upon the plain, but no post road or station house was in sight, as we expected. Nothing but a few Kirghiz kibitkas among the straggling rocks, like the tents of the Egyptian Arabs among the fallen stones of the pyramids. Toward these we now directed our course, and, in view of a rapidly approaching storm, asked to purchase a night's lodging. This was only too willingly granted in anticipation of the coming tomasha, or exhibition. The milkmaids, as they went out to the rows of sheep and goats tied to the lines of woolen rope, and the horsemen with reinless horses to drive in the ranging herds, spread the news from tent to tent. By the time darkness fell, the kibitka was filled to overflowing. We were given the seat of honor opposite the doorway, bolstered up with blankets and pillows. By the light of the fire curling its smoke upward through the central opening in the roof, It was interesting to note the faces of our hosts. We had never met a people of a more peaceful temperament, and, on the other hand, none more easily frightened. A dread of the evil eye is one of their characteristics. We had not been settled long before the Ishan, or itinerant dervish, was called in to drive away the evil spirits which the devil's carts might possibly have brought. Immediately on entering, he began to shrug his shoulders and to shiver as though passing into a state of trance. Our dervish acquaintance was a man of more than average intelligence. He had travelled in India, and had even heard some one speak of America. This fact alone was sufficient to warrant him in posing as instructor for the rest of the assembly. While we were drinking tea, a habit they have recently adopted from the Russians, he held forth at great length to his audience about the Amerikon. The rain now began to descend in torrents. The felt covering was drawn over the central opening, and propped up at one end with a pole to emit the clouds of smoke from the smouldering fire. This was shifted with the veering wind. Although a mere circular rib framework covered the white or brown felt, according as the occupant is rich or poor, the Kirghiz kibitka, or more properly yurt, is not as a house builded upon the sand, even in the fiercest storm. Its staunchness and comfort are surprising when we consider the rapidity with which it may be taken down and transported. In half an hour a whole village may vanish, emigrating northward in summer, and southward in winter. Many a Kirghiz cavalcade was overtaken on the road, with long tent ribs and felts tied upon the backs of two-humped camels, for the Bactrian dromedary has not been able to endure the severities of these northern climates. The men would always be mounted on the camels' or horses' backs, while the women would be perched on the oxen and bullocks, trained for the saddle and as beasts of burden. The men never walk. If there is any leading to be done it falls to the women. The constant use of the saddle has made many of the men bandy-legged, which, in connection with their usual obesity, with them a mark of dignity, gives them a comical appearance. After their curiosity regarding us had been partly satisfied, it was suggested that a sheep should be slaughtered in our honour. Neither meat nor bread is ever eaten by any but the rich Kirghiz. Their universal kumiss, corresponding to the Turkish yaourt, or coagulated milk, and other forms of lacteal dishes, sometimes mixed with meal, form the chief diet of the poor. The wife of our host, a buxom woman, who, as we had seen, could leap upon a horse's back as readily as a man, now entered the doorway, carrying a full-grown sheep by its woolly coat. This she twirled over on its back, and held down with her knee, while the butcher artist drew a dagger from his belt, and held it aloft until the assembly stroked their scant beards and uttered the solemn Bismillah. Tired out by the day's ride, we fell asleep before the arrangements for the feast had been completed. When awakened near midnight, we found that the savoury odour from the huge cauldron on the fire had only increased the attraction and the crowd. The choicest bits were now selected for the guests. These consisted of pieces of liver, served with lumps of fat from the tail of their peculiarly fat-tailed sheep. As an act of the highest hospitality, our host dipped these into some liquid grease, and then, reaching over, placed them in our mouths with his fingers. It required considerable effort on this occasion to subject our feelings of nausea to a sense of Kirghiz politeness. In keeping with their characteristic generosity, every one in the kibitka must partake in some measure of the feast, although the women, who had done all the work, must be content with remnants and bones already picked over by the host. But this disposition to share everything was not without its other aspect. We also were expected to share everything with them. We were asked to bestow any little trinket or knick-knack exposed to view, an extra nut on the machine, a handkerchief, a packet of tea, or a lump of sugar, excited their cupidity at once. The latter was considered a bonbon by the women and younger portion of the spectators. The attractive daughter of our host, Kumiss John, amused herself by stealing lumps of sugar from our pockets. When the feast was ended, the beards were again stroked, the name of Allah solemnly uttered by way of thanks for the bounty of heaven, and then each gave utterance to his appreciation of the meal. Before retiring for the night, the dervish led the prayers, just as he had done at sunset. The praying mats were spread, and all heads bowed toward Mecca. The only preparation for retiring was the spreading of blankets from the pile in one of the kibitkas. The Kirghiz are not in the habit of removing many garments for this purpose, and under the circumstances we found this custom a rather convenient one. 6 of us turned in on the floor together, forming a semicircle, with our feet toward the fire. Kumis John, who was evidently the pet of the household, had a rudely constructed cot at the far end of the kibitka. Verneuil, the old Almaty, with its broad streets, low wood and brick houses, and Russian signboards, presented a Siberian aspect. The ruins of its many disastrous earthquakes, lying low on every hand, told us at once the cause of its deserted thoroughfares. The terrible shocks of the year before our visit killed several hundred people, and a whole mountain in the vicinity sank. The only hope of its persistent residents is a branch from the Trans-Siberian or Trans-Caspian Railroad, or the reannexation by Russia of the fertile province of Ili, to make it an indispensable depot. Despite these periodical calamities, Verneuil has had, and is now constructing under the genius of the French architect Paul L. Gourdet, some of the finest edifices to be found in Central Asia. The orphan asylum, a magnificent 3-story structure, is now being built on experimental lines, to test its strength against earthquake shocks. One of the chief incidents of our pleasant sojourn was afforded by Governor Ivanov. We were invited to head the procession of the Cossacks on their annual departure for their summer encampment in the mountains. After the usual religious ceremony, they filed out from the city parade ground. Being unavoidably detained for a few moments, we did not come up until some time after the column had started. As we dashed by to the front, with the American and Russian flags fluttering side by side from the handlebars, cheer after cheer arose from the ranks, and even the governor and his party doffed their caps in acknowledgment. At the camp we were favored with a special exhibition of horsemanship. By a single twist of the rein, the steeds would fall to the ground, and their riders crouch down behind them as a bulwark in battle. Then, dashing forward at full speed, they would spring to the ground, and leap back again into the saddle, or, hanging by their legs, would reach over and pick up a handkerchief, cap, or a soldier supposed to be wounded. All these movements we photographed with our camera. Of the endurance of these Cossacks and the Kirghiz horses we had a practical test. Overtaking a Cossack courier in the early part of a day's journey, he became so interested in the velocipede, as the Russians called the bicycle, that he determined to see as much of it as possible. He stayed with us the whole day, over a distance of 55 miles. His chief compensation was in witnessing the surprise of the natives, to whom he would shout across the fields to come and see the tomasha, adding in explanation that we were the American gentlemen who had ridden all the way from America. Our speed was not slow, and frequently the poor fellow would have to resort to the whip, or shout, "Slowly, gentlemen, my horse is tired. The town is not far away. It is not necessary to hurry so." The fact is that in all our experience we found no horse of even the famed Kirghiz or Turkoman breed that could travel with the same ease and rapidity as ourselves even over the most ordinary road. At Verneuil we began to glean practical information about China, but all except our genial host, M. Gourdet, counselled us against our proposed journey. He alone, as a traveller of experience, advised a divergence from the Siberian route at Altin Imel, in order to visit the Chinese city of Kuldia, where, as he said, with the assistance of the resident Russian consul, we could test the validity of the Chinese passport received, as before mentioned, from the Chinese minister at London. A few days later we were rolling up the valley of the Ili, having crossed that river by the well-constructed Russian bridge at Fort Ilisk, the head of navigation for the boats from Lake Balkash. New faces here met our curious gaze. As an ethnological transition between the inhabitants of Central Asia and the Chinese, We were now among two distinctly agricultural races, the Dungans and the Taranchis. As the invited guests of these people on several occasions, we were struck with their extreme cleanliness, economy, and industry, but their deep-set eyes seemed to express reckless cruelty. The Mohammedan mosques of this people are like the Chinese pagodas in outward appearance, while they seem to be Chinese in half Kirghiz garments. Their women, too, do not veil themselves, although they are much more shy than their rugged sisters of the steppes. Tenacious of their word, these people were also scrupulous about returning favors. Our exhibitions were usually rewarded by a spread of sweets and yellow Dungan tea. Of this we would partake beneath the shade of their well-trained grape arbors, while listening to the music, or rather discord, of a peculiar stringed instrument played by the boys. Its bow of 2 parts was so interlaced with the strings of the instrument as to play upon 2 at every draw. Another musician usually accompanied by beating little sticks on a saucer. These are the people who were introduced by the Manchus to replace the Kalmucks in the Kuldia district, and who in 1869 so terribly avenged upon their masters the blood they previously caused to flow. The fertile province of Kuldia, with a population of 2½ million, was reduced by their massacres to one vast necropolis. On all sides are canals that have become swamps, abandoned fields, wasted forests, and towns and villages in ruins, in some of which the ground is still strewn with the bleached bones of the murdered. As we ascended the Ili valley, piles of stones marked in succession the sites of the towns of Turgen, Jarkent, Akent, and Korgos, names which the Russians are already reviving in their pioneer settlements. The largest of these, Jarkent, is the coming frontier town to take the place of evacuated Kuldia. About 22 miles east of this point, the large white Russian fort of Korgos stands bristling on the bank of the river of that name, which, by the Treaty of 1881, is now the boundary line of the Celestial Empire. On a ledge of rocks overlooking the ford a Russian sentinel was walking his beat in the solitude of a dreary outpost. He stopped to watch us as we plunged into the flood, with our Russian telega for a ferry boat. "All's well," we heard him cry as, bumping over the rocky bottom, we passed from Russia into China. Ah yes, we thought, all's well that ends well. But this is only the beginning. A few minutes later we dashed through the arched driveway of the Chinese custom house, and were several yards away before the lounging officials realized what it was that flitted across their vision. "Stop! Come back!" they shouted in broken Russian. Amid a confusion of chattering voices, rustling gowns, clattering shoes, swinging pigtails, and clouds of opium and tobacco smoke, we were brought into the presence of the head official. Putting on his huge spectacles, he read aloud the visé written upon our American passports by the Chinese minister in London. His wonderment was increased when he further read that such a journey was being made on the foot-moved carriages, which were being curiously fingered by the attendants. Our garments were minutely scrutinized, especially the buttons, while our caps and dark-colored spectacles were taken from our heads and passed round for each to try on in turn, amid much laughter. Owing to the predominant influence of Russia in these northwestern confines, our Russian papers would have been quite sufficient to cross the border into Kuldia. It was only beyond this point that our Chinese passport would be found necessary, and possibly invalid. After the usual visés had been stamped and written over, we were off on what proved to be our 6 months' experience in the Middle Kingdom, or Central Empire, as the natives call it, for to Chinamen there is a 5th point of the compass, the center, which is China. Not far on the road we heard the clatter of hoofs behind us. A Kalmuk was dashing toward us with a portentous look on his features. We dismounted in apprehension. He stopped short some 20 feet away, leaped to the ground, and crawling up on hands and knees began to chin-chin, or knock his head on the ground before us. This he continued for some moments, and then without a word gazed at us in wild astonishment. Our perplexity over this performance was increased when, at a neighboring village, a bewildered Chinaman sprang out from the speechless crowd and threw himself in the road before us. By a dexterous turn we missed his head, and passed over his extended queue. Kuldia, with its Russian consul and Cossack station, still maintains a Russian telegraph and postal service. The mail is carried from the border in a train of 3 or 4 telegas, which rattle along the primitive roads in a cloud of dust, with armed Cossacks galloping before and after, and a Russian flag carried by the herald in front. Even in the Kuldia post office a heavily armed picket stands guard over the money chest. This postal caravan we now overtook encamped by a small stream, during the glaring heat of the afternoon. We found that we had been expected several days before, and that quarters had been prepared for us in the postal station at the town of Suidun. Here we spent the night, and continued on to Kuldia the following morning. Although built by the Chinese, who call it Ninyuan, Kuldia, with its houses of beaten earth, strongly resembles the towns of Russian Turkestan. Since the evacuation by the Russians, the Chinese have built around the city the usual quadrangular wall, 30 feet in height and 20 feet in width, with parapets still in the course of construction. But the rows of poplars, the whitewash, and the telegas were still left to remind us of the temporary Russian occupation. For several days we were objects of excited interest to the mixed population. The doors and windows of our Russian quarters were besieged by crowds. In defense of our host we gave a public exhibition, and with the consent of the Tute, made the circuit on the top of the city walls. Fully 3,000 people lined the streets and housetops to witness the race to which we had been challenged by 4 Dungan horsemen. Riding below on the encircling roadway, the distance around was 2 miles. The horsemen started with a rush, and at the end of the first mile were ahead. At the third turning we overtook them, and came to the finish 200 yards ahead, amid great excitement. Even the commander of the Kuldia forces was brushed aside by the chasing rabble. Section 8